Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook. I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Software Requirements, 10 Traps to Avoid. Today's featured speaker is Carl Wiegers, Principal Consultant at Process Impact. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. And I'd like to say thank you to the International Requirements Engineering Board for sponsoring today's event. I'd like to introduce Stefan Sturm, the Managing Director, to say a few words.
Oh, sorry, I could not unmute myself. Hello, this is Stefan from IREB talking. I'm the Managing Director of the International Requirements Engineering Board. Welcome to this webinar from my side as well. IREB is very happy to sponsor this webinar with such a renowned expert like Carl Wiegers is. And a few words about IREB up front. The IREB is the international expert and panel when it comes to education in requirements engineering. IREB provides the CPRE Certified Professional for Requirements Engineering certification concept on requirements engineering. And I just want to point out to our website www.ireb.org for details for now. And now please enjoy the webinar with Carl. Carl, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Stefan and Tracy, and thank you to IREB for sponsoring this webinar. Greetings, everyone, from Portland, Oregon, where at the moment it's kind of trying to decide if it should rain or not. This time of year, it's pretty much always an answer is yes. And this slide shows some of the books I've written. The one on the right is kind of interesting. It's a book called Pearls from Sand, which is a memoir of life lessons I wrote a few years ago. It was a lot of fun to write something completely different from my software books. You might want to visit the goodies page at my website. The URL there is shown at the bottom of this slide. There you can access a wide variety of templates and other useful work aids for requirements and various other software domains. Now, I've been thinking about how to improve requirements practices on software projects for more than 30 years. And in that time, I've taught hundreds of requirements classes to thousands of students from all kinds of companies and government agencies. And during this time, I've observed that pretty much everybody is struggling with the same kinds of issues, over the span of multiple decades. And people are always trying to avoid or extricate themselves from common requirements traps. So today I'd like to warn you about 10 of those common traps that I've seen organizations get caught in. For each one of these traps, I'll describe several symptoms that suggest you might be getting caught in the trap, and I'll offer some specific solutions that can help you avoid it or get out of it if you're already stuck. So this slide shows a couple of the source books where you can learn more about this kind of information. The first one is the third edition of my book, Software Requirements, co-authored with Joy Beatty quite recently. And then the More About Software Requirements book, I think actually has a chapter that talks about some of these traps in it. So the first trap I've seen people run into, and I still see this happening today in discussion groups on LinkedIn and places like that, is confusion over what requirements even are, what the word even means. And some of the signs that your organization or your colleagues are struggling with this are that people talk about the requirements, and they don't put any adjectives in front of the word requirements that helps distinguish one kind of requirements information from another. And unless you start being a little bit more precise, and when we talk about the requirements, what you'll find is that people have different mental concepts of what these things are. For example, I could show each of you one statement, and this statement might be interpreted by some of you as being, a functional requirement. No, that's a solution requirement, or it's a business requirement, or a user requirement, or a feature, or a story, or all sorts of different things. And we have this serious Tower of Babel problem at the very beginning when we start talking about requirements, because we're not thinking of these words in a consistent way, and that makes it very hard to have a communication in a sensible way about them. And the thing with requirements is that it's almost entirely about communication. It's not about computing, it's about communication. Or you might be working with someone like a high-level project sponsor who just gives you a concept of what they have in mind about some new project or product, and they say, well, these are the requirements. And Most of us would look at that and say, oh, wait a minute, I have some questions. There's some information missing. That's really just an idea, not the requirements. Sometimes when you're working with users, they kind of use screens as the requirements. I've seen people talk about one-to-one mappings, for example, between, well, here's a use case and here's the screen for it. Well, it's not that simple. And what the user sees is certainly one view of the requirements, but really, more than that, it's a view of an implementation, a solution to some requirements that led to someone thinking of those screens as a design to help address the requirements. So screens alone are not a substitute for really understanding this body of information that tells us what we're trying to build and why. Or maybe you're working with some users, you being the business analyst function, you're working with some users and they provide what they think of as being the requirements, and yet you find when you pass that along to the developers, they still are not sure what they're supposed to build. Sure, they have an idea, they have some level of understanding, but they have questions. There's a lot of gaps in the knowledge. And very often one of the problems I see happening is that requirements focus just on functionality. As a consultant for the last 20 years or so, I've worked with an awful lot of organizations, and I've reviewed an awful lot of requirements specifications in various forms. And the vast, vast majority of these specifications deal with just functionality. They tend to not think about some of the other aspects of requirements and information, like quality attributes, that are a very, very important part of coming up with a clear understanding of what we're trying to build and how to tell when we've achieved that. So if you find any of these kinds of symptoms happening around your world, then it's time to improve our shared understanding. So I want to briefly describe here a model that I've used for some years to try to get my head around all these different kinds of requirements-related information. Now there's a saying about models. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. And I think that applies here. This is clearly a simplification of the entire field of requirements, but I do find it useful, and hopefully you will as well. Now, not everybody agrees on this terminology, but I'm pretty comfortable with it and it works well for me. So I like to start at the top with business requirements. Now, business requirements is one of those terms that means different things to different people. Some people think it means, well, I got this requirement from the business, therefore it is a business requirement. But I'm using business requirement here in a very specific way to refer to an understanding of why we are undertaking the project. Business requirements are a kind of why information. They help us understand business objectives, the business motivations for undertaking the project, and the kinds of benefits we're going to enjoy if all goes well and we build the right product. One place to store that kind of information is in a vision and scope document. This is a high-level guiding document that contains the information that sets the stage for all the rest of the work that we're going to do on the project. It helps align all of the participants toward a common end goal and understanding of what's in and what's out. Now, I say document, but there's nothing that says this has to be a document. Really, it's just a container for information. And of course, there's many different kinds of containers and ways that you might choose to represent that. But very often, a traditional word processing document is a good way to store this information. But that's not enough information for people to know what to build. We need to go down to another level, which are user requirements. Now, the IIBA calls these stakeholder requirements, but that's not what I'm talking about. Sure, there are lots of stakeholders, but here I am talking about specifically requirements from people who would be using the product either directly or indirectly. And so just as business requirements are a kind of why information, user requirements are a kind of what information. They describe what the users will be able to do with the product. And we might want to collect that information in some kind of a user requirements document. And this is where things like use cases and user stories become valuable because they help people understand what are users going to be able to do here. So in this little model, the solid lines mean, the solid arrows mean are stored in, and the dashed arrows mean lead to or are the source of the subsequent information. But if you stop at the user requirements level, there's still some information missing. So we need to go down to the level of functional requirements. IIBA calls these solution requirements, and I think solution requirements is a reasonable term that encompasses functional requirements and other information as well. But the functional requirements are another kind of what information. They describe what the developer builds. You don't implement business requirements. You don't implement user requirements. You implement little bits of functionality that let people get useful work done and let the software behave in certain ways. And a software requirement specification, or SRS, is a convenient place to store that. Again, this is a container. It could be a database, it could be a wiki, it could be a spreadsheet, it could be a bunch of index cards, it could be a traditional document. But you collect this information in the form of something called a software requirement specification. So this is kind of the functional flow, and you'll notice that those arrows all have to line up for a good reason. But there are other kinds of requirements information. Business rules aren't themselves requirements, but they are often the source of requirements to enforce a policy or comply with a law or perform a calculation in some specific way. We have a lot of quality attributes that we have to deal with. These are things like the ilities, usability, portability, maintainability, security, safety, a lot of things like that that have to do with not what the product does, but how well it does those things. We have external interface requirements that describe connections between our system and the rest of the world, and we have constraints that we have to observe and respect during design and implementation. So this diagram I like because it shows me that there are a lot of different kinds of requirements information. So let's start putting some adjectives that we can all agree on in front of the word, because otherwise you're going to have a hard time communicating among the different stakeholders on your project. So if you're concerned about having confusion over requirements in your organization, here are some possible solutions to try. One is to start by adopting some templates for these three different kinds of requirement sets. The business requirements can go in something I call a vision and scope document. Sometimes people use a project charter, or they use a marketing requirements document. Lots of terms we could use. User requirements, such as use cases, a template for that will give us some ideas of the bits of information that we want to record for each of the things users need to be able to do with the product. And finally, the software requirements can go into a software requirement specification, including both the functionality and these quality attributes and external interfaces and other kinds of information. So let's be sure to distinguish the functional requirements from the various kinds of non-functional requirements. There are continuing debates, even in this past week, in things like LinkedIn groups about what non-functional requirements are, and a lot of people don't like the term. But the term is out there, and I consider non-functional requirements, or NFRs, to encompass these things that address aspects beyond just what behaviors the system has to exhibit, quality attributes, constraints, external interfaces, and so forth. One of the things I like to do is when I'm in the process of eliciting requirements, maybe working with some customers to collect input, say in a workshop, or reviewing documents or other sources of input, as I encounter something that sounds like it might be a piece of requirements knowledge, I like to begin classifying it into these various categories so that I can distinguish, oh, this is a data definition, or this is probably a business rule, or this is probably a user requirement. Let me start organizing that so that I can figure out who needs that information, where should I put it, get some ideas about how I might want to record that for people to do their work based on it. So that helps us recognize that you don't want to just put everything into a great big bucket and call it all the requirements, but different people want to use this information for different purposes, so let's put it in the right place for them. And one of the things I've had people tell me over the years that's their biggest problem is that their customers don't give them requirements, they give them solutions. Well, that's very common and very not surprising, but we do want to try to distinguish solution ideas that give us an idea of one way to possibly address a requirement, distinguish those from the underlying requirement itself, the real statement of customer need, because solution ideas start imposing constraints on the requirements. That's not bad, it's not evil, but it does restrict the flexibility we have and maybe prevents us from coming up with a better solution. So these kinds of approaches might help you avoid some of the confusion over what requirements are that lead to teams not working together very effectively. For generations now, one of the other biggest traps people fall into is inadequate customer involvement. And here are some signs that might be an issue for you. I like to subdivide the community of users into multiple user classes, all of whom have different, maybe some overlaps, but largely different sets of requirements. And if we don't get input from some of those user classes, or we don't even identify some of them in the first place, then we're going to probably have a problem, because their needs are not likely to be addressed very well. So let's make sure we do a very thorough job of trying to identify our various classes of stakeholders, and then within those user classes, and then figure out who will actually be the literal voice of the customer for each of those user classes. Sometimes we can't really work with direct users, or we think we can't, or we don't try to. Instead, we try to have surrogates attempt to speak for the members of a particular user class. Some of these user surrogates might be the managers in an organization of the actual people who will be using the software. Marketing people typically are acting as surrogates for a faceless mass of people we're going to try to sell our product to. Sometimes developers are trying to stand in the place of surrogates or certain subject matter experts. So sometimes those people can do a pretty good job of representing user needs, but a lot of times they can't. Their information might not be accurate, it might be obsolete, it might be overly narrow in view. So let's make sure that we don't get distracted by that and go down the wrong path. You'll also have a good clue that you don't have a good enough customer involvement problem or situation if your developers have to end up making many of the requirements decisions. I love to have developers ask questions and to come up with ideas and suggestions, but I don't think developers should be resolving a lot of your requirements, questions, and issues, or resolving conflicts between sets of requirements that might have come from other sources or multiple sources. And the ultimate indication that you didn't really do a good job of customer involvement is if you unveil your new product to the world and people say, oh, your baby is ugly. And I've heard some sad stories from people in real companies who had this happen, who found when they presented the application to their users, they said that this is not what we had in mind at all. And of course, people are working in good faith and doing the best they can. But when you spend a lot of time and effort and energy on something and you find you zigged when you should have zagged and people aren't happy with what you built, that's a problem. We don't want to get to the end only to learn that. Instead, we want to try to get a clue that we're maybe having that problem along the way and build in mechanisms to avoid it. So here are some solutions that have been found to work very well for trying to engage customers in an ongoing and effective fashion on projects. Begin by identifying your various user classes and think of who's actually going to be a suitable representative of those. And in my requirements book, software requirements book, I describe a model that we started using in 1985 when I was working as a software developer at Kodak. Right after I transitioned from my career in chemistry into software, we came up with this idea of product champions as key user representatives who can speak for the members of certain user classes. And this worked very well for us, and we found that we made much more progress on projects when we had good product champions than if we were just fumbling around trying to ask a bunch of people for what they thought they needed. Incidentally, the worst question you can ask during requirements elicitation is, what do you want? That's a very bad question because nobody really knows how to answer that. And another very bad question, probably the second worst question, is what are your requirements? Because people who haven't worked on projects before and dealt with requirements don't really know how to answer that question. So a BA has to do a much more skillful job of eliciting information than simply asking those kinds of blanket questions. Now, if you're working in a commercial environment, you might not have access to actual users, and there you might use focus groups to get input. Focus groups typically don't have any decision-making authority, but they're a good way to bounce ideas off people and kind of brainstorm and get feedback on specific questions. Very important early in a project, determine who your requirements decision makers will be. There are a lot of decisions that have to be made. There are conflicts to resolve. There are details to fill in. There are priorities to set. There are change decisions to make. And so figure out who your decision makers will be and discuss what their decision-making process will be like, and do that before they confront their first significant decision. A good way to identify or to engage users in the process is to have them evaluate prototypes. A prototype is a partial, preliminary, or possible solution to some part of your requirements, and it's a way to make things a little more tangible, a little more real for people so they can give you some feedback and help make sure we're on the right course. I like to have some of my key user representatives, like the product champions, actually participate in reviews of requirement specifications. No matter how good of a job the BA does writing them, there's going to be problems. There's going to be errors and ambiguities and omissions, and we need input with the eyeballs of other people who are closer to the project to help us find those errors as early as possible. I cannot stress too strongly the importance of peer reviews. I wrote a book on this topic some years ago because I think it's just an absolutely critical success factor for any software project or any technical activity, really, and particularly when it comes to requirements. You might also work with your users to determine what are their acceptance criteria. How would they judge that a product was suitable for use, suitable for installation, and suitable for buying even. So let's use acceptance criteria not as a substitute for full testing, but as a way to get a perspective of how users view doneness and goodness. Now, one of the real problems we have with requirements leads to our next trap, which are vague and ambiguous requirements. Ambiguities show up in multiple ways. One form of ambiguity is when I read a requirement myself and I say, could mean this, could mean that. I'm not sure what it's supposed to be, but at least I caught the ambiguity. And another sort of ambiguity is a little tougher, and that's when you give requirements to several people to look at and maybe do work based on the requirement, and they read it and they understand it, but it means something different to each of them. And you know, this happens in daily life. I remember years ago I was talking to my dad about my next car, and I said, you know, I think for the next car I buy, I'd like to get one of those high mileage gas electric hybrids. And my dad said, well, I'm not sure you're going to be able to find a used one. I'm thinking, used? I didn't say anything about a used car. Now when I said in that conversation high mileage, I meant lots of miles per gallon. When my dad heard high mileage, he thought big number on the odometer. And these are both perfectly legitimate interpretations of the phrase high mileage, but we miscommunicated, and this was with someone I felt like I've known my entire life. Now in conversations, you can kind of catch through body language when someone looks puzzled or responds with a non sequitur like that. But if you're communicating through written specifications, like if you're outsourcing development, you don't have those opportunities for this course correction. Sometimes requirements are missing information and developers have to go chase it down or make their best guess. If the requirements aren't verifiable, if you can't think of how you could test it to see if it was properly implemented, then that could be due to the requirement being unclear or having multiple possible interpretations. If you find the developers have to keep coming back with questions to pin down things they aren't sure about or get more knowledge, then that's a clue that our requirements were not adequately specified. And ultimately, if the developers have to guess a lot as to what's being requested, that's a real clue that the requirements are vague. It's great fun to write vague requirements because the developer might like those. It lets them build whatever they feel like building at the moment. Customers might like vague requirements because it allows them to redefine what the requirements mean at any given time. And that's all great fun, but it doesn't help you build good software products in an efficient way. So here are some of the recommendations that can help you with vague and ambiguous requirements. You're probably familiar with the idea of peer reviews, but you may not be familiar with the idea of inspections. An inspection is a particular type of formal, well-structured, very thorough peer review. And I think one of the most powerful quality activities we have available to the industry is to inspect requirements deliverables, because it costs so much more to fix a problem in a delivered product than it does in the concept stage at the requirements level. I'm a big fan of writing tests against requirements. You can start testing your software the moment after you wrote your first requirement by thinking about how you might tell if it was properly implemented. And every time I've done that, I've had a set of tests, I've had a set of requirements, I can map them together, and I find errors that way every time. So I think that's a really powerful technique. You can build ways to represent requirements in different fashions other than just text, say. So you can draw analytical models, visual models. We have many notations that are useful for representing different views of the requirements information. And by modeling those, and especially comparing that against your tests, against your written requirements, again, you'll find gaps in your knowledge and inconsistencies. Prototypes are a way to make the requirements more tangible so people can chew on them and give you some feedback. A lot of times ambiguity arises because people just don't understand key terms in certain ways. So a glossary of these key terms is a really valuable thing to build. And also there are just a whole bunch of intrinsically subjective, ambiguous words that I just don't like to see in requirement spec. Minimize, maximize, optimize. How do you know you couldn't have got it just a little bit faster or a little bit smaller? User-friendly. Don't ever write down a requirement that the system shall be user-friendly. Everybody wants user-friendly. Nobody wants user-hostile software or user-surly software. But what does user-friendly mean? So while these are very bad words that I think you should avoid, they should all lead to discussions because there's an important idea behind each of them. Improved. Improved in what way, by how much, compared to what? So that should be a conversation to help us understand what the user's expectations are, etc. It's very bad because you don't know where the list ends. Include, or even better, including but not limited to. I see that all the time, and it's a really bad thing to say. So there's just a lot of words that I think we want to avoid. And my software requirements book has got a long table of these with some suggestions about better ways to approach it. So watch out for those scary words. Now, another common trap is unprioritized requirements. People claim all their requirements are critical, so I wouldn't have told you about them if it wasn't critical, if it wasn't something I needed. So we don't need to prioritize them. I just need it all. Well, that's not very helpful because sometimes you can't do it all. Or even if you do priorities, maybe you do low, medium, and high. That's a very common approach, and it doesn't matter what you call them. If there are 3 levels, it boils down to low, medium, and high. But maybe people interpret what high priority means in a different way. And so what I think is high priority, maybe somebody else might consider medium priority because we don't have clear definitions about what high actually means. So maybe you go through some prioritization activity, and yet almost all of your requirements still come out high. What this does is it gives the project manager very, very little latitude for how to adjust the project over time to make sure that we can deliver the most useful functionality as quickly and cheaply as possible. And if something changes, then does it just go to the end of the queue, or how would you know what to bump to a lower level so that the thing that just showed up can get done in the right sequence? You need some priorities so that you can make good decisions about what order to do things in. Now, sometimes developers don't like to deal with priorities because it suggests you can't do it all. Well, I got news. You probably can't. We can't do everything on projects, certainly not all at the same time. So the fact is we have to use priorities to help us figure out how to build a foundation on which to then grow the rest of the product in some rational way to deliver value over time. And I talked to a guy once years ago who just had this wonderful phrase. He described the last phase of every software development project. No matter what life cycle you're following, the last phase is always the rapid de-scoping phase. Isn't that a beautiful expression? We all have a good mental image of what that means. You know, you're trying to throw stuff overboard and get the boat into shore before it sinks, get it in on time. And you know, at that point, you're making priority decisions. The problem is that we don't want to be making priority decisions when we're coming under the gun in the last minute. You want to be able to do that along the way on an ongoing basis so that we're always adapting to and focusing on the next part of the project to add value. So here are some tips for avoiding this trap. First of all, I think it's important to align your functional requirements with your higher priority user requirements. You should be implementing the functionality that aligns with providing the most important or most timely user capabilities. Similarly, we want to make sure that our functional requirements are aligned with our business requirements. It's not very helpful to go off and work on something that doesn't align with achieving the desired business objectives for the project. So let's make sure we have this set of connections so we always know why we're doing each thing that we're doing. If you do have priority categories like high, medium, and low, and there's nothing wrong with that, then just define those unambiguously. And our book actually suggests some meanings for what high, medium, and low mean. We don't really have time to go into that right now, I'm afraid. But you want to have everybody in the team have a clear understanding of when we say high priority, what does that mean to us? And my definition of high priority is that this capability must be delivered in the next release or the next increment, you know, whatever approach you're using. But if something could wait till a later release or a later iteration, it's not high priority. That's a definition. Now, if we can agree on requirement priorities with a conversation and a handshake, great. Do things as simply as you can, but sometimes we can't. And so I've got a spreadsheet tool. It's available at the goodies page at processimpact.com. And this spreadsheet tool is a way to analytically prioritize the discretionary requirements, not the core stuff that has to be there, but the stuff that you have some flexibility over. And then we can allocate these requirements based on their priority to upcoming releases and iterations, recognizing that things will change. So I think every project, whether you're working in an agile way or not, you should be dynamically reprioritizing the work that remains in your backlog so that the most important stuff is always floating up to the top. Now, one of the biggest irritations I've found is when people ask me to build certain functionality and no one ever used it. I always found that very irritating because if they weren't going to use it, I could have worked on something else. And this is a common problem. People have done studies and found that for big applications, often a large percentage, a horrifying percentage of the functionality is rarely or never used. And when I was working at Kodak, we tried to coach our customers to try to distinguish the steel they needed from the chrome they'd like to have. I kind of like that phrase. So that you'll get a really good clue that people are falling into this trap if they demand that you build certain features, especially if they're high priority, and then you just find that it doesn't get used. And sometimes they don't get used because the functionality that seemed interesting or seemed like a good idea isn't directly related to accomplishing specific business tasks, such as performing a certain use case. We also have to watch out for gold plating, where developers add functionality because they're sure the users are going to love it and they just put it in there. Well, occasionally the users will. A lot of times they won't really care or don't find it useful. So I'm not saying developers shouldn't be creative. I'm saying we should discuss it with the right people before we build it. So to help avoid this trap, let's make sure we derive our functional requirements from an understanding of what the user's goals are, the user's requirements, like in use cases or stories. Let's make sure we know where every requirement came from. You should be able to trace it back to its origin. So if someone asks, why am I building this? There's an answer. You might identify the stakeholders who would benefit from each of the features you implement. And then just a couple of words about this analytical prioritization method, which also will help you avoid this trap. First of all, we want to have our customers rate the value of each proposed requirement. And value has two components. The benefit we will achieve if it's there, but the penalty we might incur if it's not there. But we have to balance that against a technical view. So we want to think about the cost of implementing each requirement and the technical risk of not being able to get it right on the first try. And this helps us avoid working on requirements that have a pretty high cost, but don't have much value that they provide to the customers. Now, historically, one of the dreaded traps here has been analysis paralysis. And you have a clue about that if it just seems like requirements development goes on forever, sort of the classic waterfall worst case. Maybe you find new versions of the requirement spec are continually being released so that eventually your version numbers look like IP addresses. Maybe the requirements are never baselined. We never reach an agreement on what it is we're going to be building. You find people just spending a lot of time drawing pictures and modeling of the requirements and never get around to deciding, yeah, this is good enough. And we have this sort of philosophy that the design and coding can't start until the requirements are done. Well, I got news. Your requirements are probably never going to be done. Instead, what we have to do is get each set of requirements that we want to work on, each chunk of them, to be good enough to let us proceed. So here are some solutions. First of all, remember your product is not a requirement specification. Your product is something with software in it. So let's focus on achieving that outcome. You need to choose an appropriate development life cycle depending on how well understood the problem is, the nature of your team, your culture, the timelines. There's a lot of factors. There are a lot of projects for which a waterfall approach still works fine. There are many other projects for which incremental approaches and rapidly evolving approaches, which is what the agile strategies were originally intended to address, where those work fine. So choose an appropriate life cycle, and don't expect to get all the requirements right for the whole thing, but you do need to do chunks of requirements that we then agree on. So we decide when each set of requirements for the next chunk of work we're doing are good enough to let us proceed with construction at an acceptable level of risk. And the risk we're concerned about is having to do excessive, unplanned rework, which wastes effort and time. There's always going to be a certain amount of rework, but I think we can usually reduce it to a lower level than we often. So how do you know when your requirements are good enough? Unfortunately, no little green light comes on that says, ping, good enough, go ahead. So we need to have people who are in the know review these things to be able to make that kind of judgment. So the people you want to pull together to review some set of requirements would include business analysts. In fact, ideally, if you're a BA, I would hope that you're kind of building some relationships and partnerships with other BAs that you know, so that you can look over each other's work and look for problems, look for ways that the requirements can be made better. Even if you're not an expert on the project, you can provide value to your associates by providing this external perspective, and they'll return the favor, I hope. In a healthy culture they will, by looking over your material and helping us not only find errors then, but learn better ways to work by looking over each other's shoulders. So don't be protective of your knowledge. Share your knowledge with your colleagues. We need customers to review things. As a consultant, I've reviewed a lot of requirement specs, and I can find many kinds of problems, but what I can't judge is whether the requirements I'm presented with are the right ones for the business problem being addressed. You need your customers or other subject matter experts to provide that perspective. We should also have people review the requirements who are going to be the downstream victims of the requirements, the people who are going to have to do the work based on whatever requirements they receive. And those would be people like developers and testers and support people. So put together a group of people for each set of requirements who you think would be effective at finding errors, and find them before they bite you. I'm a huge fan of modeling. I started learning about visual modeling 30 years ago, and it totally changed my view of how to approach software development. But you don't necessarily have to model the whole thing. You should model the complex parts, the uncertain parts of the system, the parts that you are trying hardest to understand, where the most of the risk is. So focus your analysis in sensible places for the maximum value. People often include user interface designs right in their requirement spec, and I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. You're getting a ways into design then and making lots of decisions about how you're actually going to build a solution, and that's just going to slow down the requirements process further. Obviously, at some point we need to do that, but you'll notice they're called user interface designs. So it's really something that's based on requirements. Yeah, you iterate, you go back and forth, you learn more as you start working on designs. It helps you understand and refine your requirements. But I would not necessarily try to pin down all of your user interface specifics while you still think you're talking about requirements. All right, getting near the end, I know this is a very depressing talk. Here we're looking at all these terrible things that can go wrong on projects, and I'm guessing that a fair number of these things have happened to you. In fact, what I hope you will do after we go through this, I hope you'll go back to work and look at your own environment. Maybe talk to some of the other people in your community and your project team, your organization, and reflect on how many of these things are happening to you. It's one thing to just take some kind of a learning experience for an hour or a day or whatever, and then you go back to work. But I want you to get some value from this. I want you to go back to work and say, let's think about this. Are we having any of these symptoms? Is there maybe something going on that we haven't really confronted yet? And then look for some of the solutions and see if they'll help you avoid the traps or otherwise improve the ways that you deal with the requirements on your project. So scope creep is one of the dreaded threats that has approached nearly every project over time. There's probably never been a project completed that did exactly what somebody thought it was going to do early on. They almost always grow. And in fact, people have studied this. People like Capers-Jones have got a lot of data on project performance and behaviors, and found that on average, larger long-term projects tend to grow on average of something like 1 to 3% per month. Well, if you're on a one-year project, that means it could end up being, 20, 30% bigger at the end of the project than you thought it was going to be at the beginning. So you just have to deal with that. But scope creep is when we don't see it coming and we don't really confront it. It just keeps happening. We find new requirements just keep coming in, but of course your schedule never changes. You don't get more people, nothing gets taken out, and so your project gets bigger and bigger. One of the other problems is that your project scope might never have been clearly defined. Now, here's an interesting thought. How do you even know you're experiencing scope creep if the stakeholders never sat down and agreed on what the scope was? If you never clearly defined and agreed to the scope, then maybe you get the sense that it keeps getting bigger and bigger, but is that really creep? Because we didn't have a reference against which to judge it. Maybe we just missed a bunch of stuff and didn't think about it. Another problem with scope creep, or really this is more a symptom that your scope was not well defined in the first place, is that somebody suggests a requirement and it's in, but then later on somebody says, no, that's out, but then it comes back and it's sort of whack-a-mole. You know, the requirements are in and out and in and out. And that often suggests that we haven't thought carefully about what our real objectives are and what the scope is of the project, what subset of this fantasy we'd like to have someday, what subset of that are we really trying to build during each chunk of the work. Or maybe you find that some people bypass the process. I was at a company once and I asked them about how requirements changes made it into the project. Nobody said anything for a minute. And somebody said, well, if our customers want to make a change, then they go talk to either Bruce or Sandy, because they know Bruce and Sandy will put the change in and the rest of us will give them a hard time about it. I didn't think that was a great process. Your process shouldn't depend on just, you know, who you're going to call to get something done. So if you find that changes are coming into the back door instead of through whatever change process you've established, that's a clue that you might be getting a lot of growth of requirements in an uncontrolled kind of fashion. There's also this idea of sign-off. Sign-off could mean a lot of different things, a lot of places, and sometimes it's just a ritual. It's a hoop we jump through, a formality we perform that doesn't really mean anything. And what happens sometimes in that case is you get this sign-off, whatever that means in your world, and people go off and work on the project for a while and come back, and the powers who did the sign-off said, well, yeah, I signed off on the requirements, but I didn't have time to read those. I didn't really understand it. I trusted you guys, and yet this is what you present to me? No, you let me down. Well, those aren't really very fun conversations to have. So if we want to try to do a better job of managing scope, and not suppressing scope creep, but controlling it so that it doesn't cause the project to fail, here are some possible solutions to consider. First of all, let's try to figure out why is it happening. And I think what you'll find is that a little root cause analysis goes a long way. I'm a big fan of root cause analysis. So when things aren't ideal, let's take some time to think about why didn't everything go quite the way we had in mind. And so when you do that, you very well might find that, for example, your elicitation isn't good enough, or maybe we overlooked some user classes, or we overlooked a whole area of functionality that we had to cram in later on. So I don't know what you'll find, but I think root cause analysis is a good way to make sure you can do something different the next time that'll actually address the issues, not just hope that it comes out differently. Let's document the product vision and the project scope. I specifically distinguish the product vision of what we're going to build and the project scope that says here's what's in for the project or for the next iteration. Let's record those in a way that people can agree to. Part of that should involve defining the boundaries and interfaces between your system and the rest of the outside world so we can fit all the pieces together properly and know who's responsible for what happens on each side of those interfaces. I think you should have a change control process, and I think you should follow that change control process for all changes. We put a process like that in place at Kodak, and I'd go walking down the hall in the research labs, and somebody would say, hey, I got an idea for something we want to add to that system you're working on, and I'd hear it, and I'd say, okay, sounds reasonable. Go ahead and put it into the change process, and we'll take a look at it. And about half of those never showed up. And I figure if this is not important enough to you to take literally 2 minutes to make a very simple entry in a system you know how to use, then I don't care at all. Now, I don't care how it gets in there. I might say, oh yeah, good idea, I'll put it in when I get back. Fine. But if it's not in there, you don't work on it. It doesn't exist. You might find that you have to improve your elicitation approach, and that some of your scope creep is really just that we missed a bunch of requirements during elicitation. And so maybe we need to do a better way to use techniques that'll help us miss fewer things in the future. You know, sign-off is the ritual, but the real process here is baselining, a matter of setting an agreement, forging an agreement on a set of requirements and say, for this chunk of work coming up next, here is our agreement about what stuff goes in there. And that then serves as the reference for the changes. You make changes against a baseline. And the thing that nobody likes to hear But it's a sad reality is that when requirements change, you have to be prepared to renegotiate your project commitments. Change is not free. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, and very often change is important and value added. But it has a price tag. Even the time you spend discussing a change that's been requested and then maybe deciding not to do it still costs you something. So you have to be prepared to renegotiate commitments if your project gets bigger. Well, a sign that you have an inadequate change process for dealing with all these things is that maybe you have no change process, and anybody who feels like accepting a change and working on it is free to do so. If you do find people bypassing the change process, that's another clue that the process doesn't work well. Maybe they talk to their buddies on the team like Bruce and Sandy in the example I gave earlier, or maybe the developers implement changes that were rejected by the decision makers because they thought it was important. Or perhaps in the desire to get things done and moving along quickly, they work on proposed changes before they're actually approved, which could end up not being the right choice because maybe that means something more important doesn't get done. It's always a little surprising if new functionality all of a sudden shows up during testing and the testers say, wait a minute, I didn't expect this to be there. Oh yeah, we put that in. But it wasn't documented anywhere, and nobody knew to expect it and didn't know to test it, and there's a surprise there. If you can't go back and look at the status of your change requests and say, oh yes, we know which ones are approved, which ones aren't, then there's a problem with your change process. Also, if we don't communicate those changes to everyone who's affected by them, there's definitely a shortcoming. And I mentioned earlier the importance of knowing who makes decisions for requirements, and that would include understanding who's going to be making change request decisions. So to beef up your change process, put into place a practical change control process. Doesn't have to be burdensome, doesn't have to be a barrier. It's a process, it's a structure. And your people who are going to be making decisions are typically called the change control board. Sometimes that scares people away, but it could be one person maybe if that person's authorized to make those kinds of decisions. It's usually a small group who will maybe use a tool to collect and track and communicate changes so that they can make the right decisions and pass those along to the people who need to know. But remember, a tool is not a substitute for a process. They are not interchangeable. Put into place some policies about what kinds of changes, what scope of changes are accepted and how they're handled and who makes those decisions. And every time you do decide to do something different, compare the priorities of new requirements that come in against your backlog of remaining requirements so you can do things in the right order. Well, one other trap here for change management is not doing a good job of impact analysis. And maybe you're walking down the hall and somebody says, hey, could you guys add this new feature to that system? And you hear the idea and you say, yeah, I think we can do that. You go back to your office and you start thinking about it and you start peeling away the layers of the onion, and as you do, the onion gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden you realize, wow, this is a lot more complicated than I thought when I was talking to Susie in the hall. Plus, I think it's the exact opposite of what we agreed to do for Fred last week. So I'm in trouble because I said, sure, no problem. So let's not be hasty about that. Maybe your change turns out to be more complex, it's going to take longer, might even not be something you can technically do. And the change very well might cause your whole project to slip, especially if it's on the critical path. Sometimes you find you didn't do a good job of impact analysis if as you're working on the project, on that change, you keep finding more and more bits that you have to change. There's a database, there's a help screen, there's a user interface form, all sorts of things you have to keep up with. So before you say, sure, no problem, let's take the time to do a little impact analysis. Consider the implications of accepting it on the rest of the project and on the technical performance, all the other ramifications. Think about the tasks you might have to do to be able to successfully incorporate this change, and then do a little project management planning, that's what I was trying to say, so that you can figure out what kind of impact might this have on our overall effort for the project and schedule. Maybe there's a trade-off where you have to do something later that you were planning to do sooner because this change came along. So just understand the consequences before you say yes. And if we had time, I could share with you some very sad stories people have passed along to me of places where they wasted an awful lot of effort on projects because they didn't do impact analysis and ended up throwing away a lot of work because it was bigger than the customer was willing to pay for in the final analysis. Requirements traceability information can be very helpful with impact analysis as you look at a bunch of threads that tie user requirements to functional requirements to bits of architecture and design work to chunks of code to tests and so forth. That traceability information will help you get a sense of just what all work might you have to do if a particular change is approved. And try to estimate these costs and balance that against the benefits before you make the commitments. Remember, commitments to changes are always going to have some kind of a price tag. Now, maybe you've had a conversation like the following sometime in your career. Maybe you're sitting around in a meeting and looking at some requirements and somebody says something like this, man, I finally finished that multi-vendor catalog query function. That was a lot of work. And you say, well, wait a minute. I thought the customer canceled that feature. No, it's right here at the top of page 5 of my requirement spec, says the other person. And you're looking at your copy and it says, well, it's not on my copy. Well, what version have you got? 3.2? What version have you got? Oh, crap, mine says 3.2 also. They're the same version, but they're different stuff. I don't know what to believe. So if you've ever had an experience like that where people are trying to sing the song from different sheets of music, then you're not doing a very good job of version control. Another symptom is that changes that are approved don't get incorporated into the requirement set. So maybe some people know about them and some do not. If you can't tell different versions of your requirements documentation apart, you got a problem. Different versions might have the same identifier, or maybe you've got, like I just showed here, or in the other case, where specifications or documents are identical, but yet they've got different identifiers on them. So timestamps aren't a good way to distinguish things because maybe the contents didn't change and yet you've got different timestamps. So when people are working from different versions of the requirements, they might end up implementing canceled features. They might end up, and I did have a client that told me about this, they ended up doing extensive testing, finding lots of errors, and it turns out that the tests were all written against an obsolete version of the requirement spec because they had not gotten the current version of the requirement spec, and so a lot of their tests were broken. This is the only case I've actually encountered where what was reported as a bug truly was a feature. That's a little joke we like to say. In this case, it really was true. Another problem is if maybe your change history in earlier versions of the documents are lost, and sometimes you want to go back to something for a good reason. So here are some things to try to avoid those problems. As changes come along, let's merge them together into the requirement set so that the requirements do as good a job as you can of trying to describe each chunk of the product as we've built it. Use some sort of sensible versioning scheme for the documents to keep them straight. Even better than that, let's put them under version control using check-in and check-out practices to try to minimize these sorts of conflicts. Make sure people find out about the changes if they're going to be affected by them, and the best approach is to actually not use documents at all, but to use a requirements management tool, which will keep a complete history of all the requirement changes, and then you generate a requirement spec as a report from the database. So to wrap up here, after this very sad talk of all these things that can go wrong, let me give you a few keys to creating high-quality software requirements. First, you need educated people, developers, managers, customers, and of course, skillful and trained business analysts to choreograph all of this. You need to forge a collaborative customer-developer partnership with people who understand that there's different kinds of requirements information. You need to take iterative and incremental approaches to requirements development, just as we often do to software development. I think you should have some standard requirements templates, and even if you don't create normal documents, those are still pieces of information that you want to acquire. Both formal and informal requirements reviews can find a lot of errors early, as can writing tests against the requirements. You need to have some sort of sensible and ongoing requirements prioritization, as well as an effective and pragmatic change management approach. All of these together will get you a long way towards building high-quality requirements for the projects you work on. So to wrap up here, the reason that we focus on avoiding these kinds of traps is to minimize the surprise factor that happens at the end of projects. My experience has been that software surprises are almost never good news, so I'm not really too happy when we have surprises at the end. I'd like to have the surprise where someone says, "Oh, Carl, the system is so much better than I ever imagined. How can I possibly thank you?" But I've never had that conversation. That should be our goal, though. So thanks very much. If you take away only one message from this, please remember that without high-quality requirements, software is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And now a quick word from our sponsor again, IREB.
Hi, this is Stefan from IREB again, so please stay in the line. There will be a Q&A afterwards with Carl. Yeah, Carl, thanks a lot for this very interesting talk. And yeah, here's how to educate people, as Carl mentioned. In fact, Carl has been talking over 90% about the content of the CPRE Requirements Engineering Certification Scheme. We address all these topics like stakeholder identification, how to delineate scope, scope creep, how to elicit, how to negotiate requirements, how to verify, how to manage, and baselines, change process, traceability, all these buzzwords I would not say, but all these terms are addressed in the IREB syllabi, foundation level, advanced level, expert level, coming soon. And have a look at the ireb.org. You will find plenty of stuff there about the contents, and train yourself. Yeah, improve your skills. And thanks for attending the webinar. So Tracy, it's up to you now. Thank you.
Excellent. And thank you, Carl. What a great webinar today. We have a lot of questions in a very short time, so I'm going to try and get through a few of them before we have to leave. Our first question is from Dimitri. For trap number 4, Carl, the symptoms, how can we handle situations when two different stakeholders view one requirement as being of different priorities, i.e. high and low?
Well, that's a common problem, of course. Everybody thinks their requirements are most important and nobody else's matters. And so there's a couple ways to deal with that. One is to understand, as part of your user class analysis, do you have certain user classes that are more favored than others? In other words, the needs of one user class are more closely aligned with achieving your desired business objectives. If that's the case, then whichever requirement is coming from a preferred or a favored user class will get preference over someone who's maybe not in one of those user classes. And that's just a business decision. And that's why that gets back to the idea of why it's so important to understand your business objectives and make sure that all the work you do aligns with that. So another way that you can, I mean, it's a negotiation, right? But you have to know who your decision makers are and what their decision-making process is. Not everybody's going to walk away from every negotiation happy, but it has to be really done by looking at the relationship between those that particular requirement and the business objectives, so that people can come to sensible agreement about what the priorities are. And the analytical spreadsheet tool that I mentioned, that's available at my goodies page at processimpact.com, that can help you think through it in a little more rational way, so you don't just have to arm wrestle.
Excellent, Carl. Thank you. Our next question comes from Elizaveta. What methods could you advise for users who don't want to look at mock-ups? They want the app first and then decide whether they like it or not.
Oh, well, that's a really nice, expensive way to build software. That is the most expensive way to build software, is to build it and then see if people like it. Incremental approaches like Agile were specifically intended to help get around some of that kind of pure waterfall approach of saying, let's just build it and then see how we did, by taking incremental approaches. And you need to educate people. This is one of the problems, is that very often the users we work with on projects haven't worked on a software project before. They don't understand the rationale behind why we take the approaches we do. They don't understand maybe why requirements are important or why prototypes are valuable. So one of the responsibilities you have as a business analyst, or any role you have in a project, is to educate your counterparts, the other stakeholders and participants in the project, so they understand the value that comes from doing things like mock-ups or prototypes. Now, if the customers understand that, but they say, yeah, that doesn't do anything for me, then maybe you need to take some other prototyping approach. There are lots of different ways to build prototypes or mock-ups, ranging from very simple sketches to something that looks like actually working software. And maybe you need to move somewhere else along that spectrum from where you've been to get something in front of the users earlier, so that they can give you that feedback, so that you don't end up building something, throwing it away, and then building the whole thing again.
Thanks, Carl. Our next question comes from Anya. Should the customer review the SRS? Wouldn't this lead to a discussion about the solution?
Well, it could, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I like to have customers, key customers, such as the product champions I mentioned, review the SRS because we need to have a reference. You know, you can't review something in a vacuum. You have to review it against what it's something else that says this is what it's supposed to be and do. Just like you can review a design, but unless the design meets the requirements, doesn't matter how beautiful the design is, it's wrong. And if we're reviewing requirements, it doesn't matter how well written they are. If they don't address the user needs, then it's wrong. So we need to have users participate in reviewing those to make sure we've captured their expectations and needs in a sensible way. And sure, it could lead to discussion of solutions, and that sometimes helps us better understand requirements. What you don't want to do, and this means you need good review moderators who can keep the process focused, what you don't want to do is be distracted into just looking at screenshots and something like that instead of understanding the real needs that led to those solution ideas.
Thank you, Carl. And on that note, we do have a question from Amy about product champions. What do you feel is the right size? There have been problems in the
I like them about
past.
5'10".
Sorry, it's a two-part. So there have been problems in the past where the champions end up being a large group of people, possibly muddling and complicating workshops and decisions.
That absolutely can happen, and that's really one of the kinds of problems that the product champion model is intended to avoid. So first of all, what you want to do is make sure that the product champions are representing specific user classes. They're not just people who have an interest in the project or have an opinion. They're people who are speaking for members of certain user classes. Projects could have a lot of user classes. Some will, some won't, and so you need to do the user class analysis first, and that'll help you maybe keep the number of representatives you need to a smaller scale. Second thing you do is not everybody has to be in the room at the same time. The whole point of user class analysis is that different user classes have largely different sets of needs. And so when we did that in projects I worked on, the product champions for certain user classes would work with BAs separately from the product champions of other user classes. We would occasionally get product champions together, but really just for reviews. But during elicitation sessions, we never had them all in the same room at the same time because the product champion representing user class A probably doesn't have much interest in the requirements from user class B, and so that's largely wasted time for them. So you don't need to have them all in the same workshops or discussions or meetings at the same time.
Thank you so much, Carl. I am conscious of the time, so we're going to have to wrap it up at this point. Carl, thank you so much for today's presentation. It was truly fabulous. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, IREB, for sponsoring this event today. And for all of you that attended, thank you for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event. Thank you and have a great day.
Bye.